Good morning, everyone. My name is Jill Roe, and I'm chairing this session, the history question, Who Owns the Past?, which in our preliminary discussions this morning, I think we'll need to interpret quite broadly. First to speak will be Anthony Jacques from Melbourne, Napoleon's double. Next to speak will be a homegrown hero on a homegrown hero, Arthur Blackburn VC, an Australian hero, his men and their 2 world wars. And last, and as was once said to me at a school prize giving, last but not least, we have The Collector of Worlds, published by Faber, by Ilya Troyanov, who, like me, has just got here, but he's looking pretty fit on it. So we can look forward to something special from our 3 speakers. This business about who owns the past, well, it's been going on as a kind of question for a while, and as I say, we will deal with it broadly. Our speakers will speak from their own points of view and their own work, and when they've done maybe 15 minutes max, then we will open it up for discussion, as I understand is the usual way. We've been having some quite lively discussions between ourselves already. With the history question, well, you probably are familiar with the writings of Inga Clendon, who asked this question, who owns the past, where actually she described the world jostling between historians and novelists for space. And she talks about a confusion between the primary aesthetic purpose of fiction and the primarily moral purpose of history, which creates that jostling. Well, we shall see. Inga's got some rather fiercer things to say than that, but I'm going to leave it there with her remark that we can't post ourselves back in time, and we do have to acknowledge that people really did think differently then, and we will have ourselves taken back into time. I think the most recent of the figures is in fact Blackburn VC, who died in 1960, but we'll be going back to the Napoleonic era and to the era of the Age of Empire. Without further ado then, let me introduce our first speaker, Anthony. We'd agreed we'd use first names. Anthony, Napoleon's double, published by Giramondo Press, and that's at the University of New South Wales, I think. And Anthony is a writer, a photographer, a painter, a video maker, part-time lecturer in creative writing, a really versatile person. And he has many publications. But here we have, with this work, Napoleon's double, something really original and philosophical. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Good morning. Who owns the past? We'll get this out of the way pretty quickly. We own the past, you own the past. It's not a question that I'm particularly interested in talking about. We can't escape the past no matter how much we prefer to forget the past. The novelist W.G. Sebald says the past isn't even past, it's present. It's part of our makeup, it's who we are. Our names are part of the way we're inscribed in the past. My first name, Anthony, is Polish spelling, but my mother was Australian. She was a tailor, so that part of my past has been obscured. It's been written over, so it can't be seen. My last name, Jark, is Polish, and that betrays no evidence of the tailor background through the matrilineal line, and Mum's mum was a Clancy, so I've got Irish and Australian in me as well. But so names are a very important part of the way we're inscribed in the past, inscribed in history. We can't avoid history. Who is entitled to write about the past? Let's get this one out of the way pretty quickly. And historians, novelists, hobbyists, in fact everyone's entitled to write about the past. You can all have a go at writing about the past. It shouldn't be something that's just for professional historians, professional novelists. It's natural to be curious about one's origins, to be curious about the past. Now, in my opinion, there are a couple of really interesting questions, though, that relate to both history and to fiction. And one of them is, what is the relationship between history and fiction? And subsequent to that are the allied questions, how and why is history turned into fiction? And what is the role of truth in historical writing and in fiction writing? Now, Kierkegaard said we live life backwards, we live life forwards, but we understand it backwards. How true is that? We don't know what's going to happen to us today, but we're still in the middle of today trying to work out what happened to us yesterday. We're still trying to process the past. I see the connection between fiction and history as resembling something like the double helix structure of the DNA, where each is the other side of the other, and they both intertwine, they twirl one over the other in a delightful way. The word history derives from the Latin word historia, meaning history or story. We tell a story about the past either in an historical mode or via a fictive mode. Besides, both novelists and historians have something in common. They're both machines for turning coffee into words. That's a quote from Pearl Erdos, who talked about mathematicians as being machines for turning coffee into theorems. Now, Marcel Proust wrote 1.1 million words in Search of Lost Time to try and understand his personal past. And this is part of the novelist's quest in particular. The novelist is often asking, who am I? Where do I belong? How do I stand in relationship to other people? There are a different set of questions for historians in lots of ways. Now, Herodotus was called the father of history by Cicero, but his habit of relating the anecdotes of others as if they were facts, relating such things as the customs of barbarian tribes, resulted in him being called the father of lies by later historians. Napoleon read Herodotus and he read Goethe's novel The Sorrows of Young Werther. In fact, he read Young Werther 8 times as a teenager, and it really coloured his worldview. Napoleon became a mixture of his history reading, his fiction reading. They really helped to form the man. And it could be argued that Napoleon, who was an aspiring novelist, was inspired to sacrifice himself to what he saw as a great cause by reading Goethe, by reading fiction. Now, 2 of my novels, a book of poetry and a sequence of short fiction, have all incorporated research, so I owe a debt of gratitude to the historians that have assembled the primary source documents together and have written their version of accounts. However, my guess is that when I'm researching, I am looking for different things than from professional historians. I'm not looking for historical truth, but rather I'm looking for nuggets of gold that will feed my imagination, irrespective of whether they are true or not. I'm fond of asking the what-if question. About 10 years ago, when it was revealed that Saddam Hussein had 7 doubles, I asked myself, wouldn't it be interesting if Napoleon had a double or 2 in Egypt? At that time, I had forgotten about my reading of Simon Lees's fabulous novel, The Death of Napoleon, which uses the story of a double for Napoleon. It wasn't until I had almost finished my novel that I went back and looked at the Simon Lees novel. Now, after the prompting of the Saddam Hussein use of doubles, I went to the internet to see if the double theory had any validity. The internet, godsend for conspiracy theorists worldwide, gave me what I wanted it to give me, an assertion that yes, Napoleon did employ doubles, 4 of them. I wasn't worried if that was true or not. It was comforting to see that someone had made that assertion publicly. Later, I was curious again and consulted via a third party, a respected French scholar on Napoleon by the name of Jean Toulard, who said the claim of Napoleon having doubles was false, but that didn't deter me. It seemed plausible that if Napoleon wanted to have a double or 2, then Egypt would be the perfect place, as the Egyptians would have no idea what Napoleon looked like. It was an era before photography, and the drawings and paintings of the young 29-year-old Napoleon differ greatly in the way he is represented. It could well be different people portrayed. Another nugget of research gold was discovering Sir Walter Scott's assertion in his historical account of Napoleon's life that Napoleon made a pact with what Scott calls a little red man. This little red man had magic powers and would protect Napoleon while he supported the principles of the French Revolution, freedom and liberty, the 2 words that adorn the top of Napoleon's stationery. Scott says that the little red man enabled Napoleon to lead a charmed life, escaping numerous assassination attempts. As an aside, I like to mention a charming little story about Napoleon. He was in Egypt, he was resting under the noonday sun under a mud brick wall. The mud brick wall fell, injured a few of his soldiers, but he was unharmed, and he uncovered a whole stash of Roman coins. So it seems like the little red man was behind him in this particular time. So the story about the little red man, it's a great story. It's in a biography of Napoleon. It's presented as fact. I thought it was just delicious for a novelist, and I wonder what professional historians make of this assertion. It doesn't appear in the other biographies. There are something like 600,000 books written and published about Napoleon, which is a very daunting task. So when you go to try and research Napoleon, there's a surfeit of information. There's way too much to try and accommodate. Now, I've got 4 books in front of me. I've carried them all the way from Melbourne. And the first one is in the mode of historical writing, and it's by Inga Clendon. It's a very, very fine book. It's called Dancing with Strangers. I'm interested in the subtitle. This is the hardback by Canongate, and the subtitle is The True History of the Meeting of the British First Fleet and the Aboriginal Australians, 1788. So the true history, I'm interested in that, and I think we could have a good discussion later about that notion, whether it exists or not. The other book I have is a very fine novel by Martine Murray, and its title is The Slightly True Story of Cedar B. Hartley, Who Planned to Live an Unusual Life. So this is a different claim, this one for a novel rather than for a work of history, a slightly true story, a different type of claim. Now, the other book I brought with me from Melbourne is one I'm very fond of. It's The Journal of Nicholas Baudin, 1800 to 1803, monster of a book, a couple of kilos, published by your very own Libraries Board of South Australia. They've done a marvellous job, translated by Christine Cornell. She's done a wonderful job of translation. And this is a fabulous book. Love this book. For a novelist, research is so entrancing, it's so seductive. I'd rather read this than actually transform this type of stuff into novel. And similarly, when I was doing Napoleon's Double, there's a marvellous book called The Description of Egypt, which Napoleon and his savants created. 28-volume book, very large elephant quartos. They're called elephant folios, full of images, 13 books of images, and those images really fed my imagination. Images are a great way to get source material for a novelist or for a historian, because they're representing things without words, and you can see things in a very different way. Now, the serious problem I found, and I think it could well be true for other novelists with lots of source material, is that there can be too many facts. There's a period of necessary forgetting and of half glimpsing and half remembering, a process that would be anathema to a historian or to a scholar. But there it is, the truth is out. To write fiction based on historical sources, I find that you need to know, then you need to forget, then you need to imagine. Of course, this is not necessarily true for other novelists. But with Napoleon's Double, there was just way too much information to process, so I only needed a thin sliver. The other really daunting thing was my book's based on 7 conscripts who join Napoleon's army. They go to Egypt. Then some of them join the Baudin expedition to Australia. And there was a first-person account of a soldier going with Napoleon to Egypt that was brilliantly written. And I read it, first of all, to get inspiration, and then I put it aside. It was too good. It was too daunting. This is what I was trying to do. I was trying to, in a sort of third person initially, then a first person, try and recreate the voice of a soldier, try and imagine my way into the story. And this soldier who was actually there had done it beautifully, so I couldn't keep reading. Now, how many minutes, Jill? 2 or 3 minutes, that's fine. I'll skip a whole heap of pages. I will go to the end. I actually asked Jill to give me a warning, so I can go on and on. Now, this is the little end part. So, Napoleon in 1816 had been defeated at Waterloo. He was reflecting upon his personal history. He was writing his biography, and Napoleon said the following: "It must be admitted that the true truths are difficult to ascertain in history." And what is history anyway? An agreed-upon fiction, said Napoleon, quoting an earlier writer. History is based on facts, but what are facts? Oral reports, documents, images, all of which can be partial, incomplete, blurred, falsified. Even if the details can be ascertained accurately, how can the intention behind the actions be ascertained? Napoleon went on to say in the same conversation in 1816 the following: "Historical fact, which is often invoked, to which everyone so readily appeals, is often a mere word. Suppose I have given an order. Who can read the bottom of my thought, my true intention? And yet everybody will take hold of that order, measure it by his own yardstick, make it bend to conform to his plans, his individual way of thinking, and everybody will be so confident of his own version. The lesser mortals will hear of it from privileged mouths, and they will be so confident in turn. Then the flood of memoirs, diaries, anecdotes, drawing room reminiscences, and yet, my friend, that is history. Now, in summary, who owns the past? The answer is the storyteller owns the past. And those stories may be either true stories of history or the slightly true stories of fiction. Thank you for your attention.
You'll just have to ask what the bit he missed out was. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure now to introduce Andrew Faulkner. Many of you will know him quite well, I think, since he's a homegrown journalist, well known here. And you probably also know his subject, Arthur Blackburn VC. I read this with great interest. I'll leave you to say more.
You've read the book?
Of course I have.
That's dedication, isn't it? I think that makes about 32 people who've read the book now. Who owns the past? Well, in my view, I'm with Anthony on this one. No one owns the past, and I'm not particularly interested in the question either, so I'm going to stray immediately from the topic. Why do we Westerners always feel we have to own everything? More than that, I believe ascribing ownership of the past or claiming ownership of it can be dangerous. People commandeer the past to pursue certain ideologies. This is becoming more common in military history, sadly. The Australian war story is littered with as many myths as battlefields are strewn with corpses. You've all heard the jingoistic sloganeering that sprouts like a noxious weed in the week before Anzac Day. It goes something like this. The Australians won the Great War on their own, and they would have won it Gallipoli too, had they been landed on the right beach by the bloated and blundering British generals. Rather too much alliteration there, sorry. Then the Tommies messed everything up when they stopped to brew pots of tea on the beach. In France, the Australian Field Marshal Monash was the greatest general ever, and his ingenious tactics at the epic Battle of Le Hamel won the war. Rah, rah. And so on. It's everywhere. Such sweeping generalisations are based on kernels of truth, but do not stand up to any serious scrutiny. Then in the Second World War, the Aussies gave the Italian hordes a good old-fashioned thrashing in North Africa because our brave boys were physically and mentally superior. The leathery diggers scoffed at the bullets and shell bursts, tramping into the very jaws of death, singing, "We're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz." Excuse my singing voice. This is repeated in myriad histories of the North Africa campaign. If anything, they did sing south of the border, but that was only one section of about 10 men. And I'd argue for not very long. Complete rot. This kind of rubbish devalues the bravery and sacrifice made by Australian soldiers. And is also a slur on the Italians sent to their deaths in tanks with armour little thicker than that of the Aussies' bully beef tins. Left unchecked, it might taint the true and sacred record. Now to perhaps the most contentious ground. It goes like this. If it wasn't for the brave diggers on the Kokoda track, the Japanese would have strolled into Brisbane. When he released his book Invading Australia 2 years ago, the Australian Museum's Dr. Peter Stanley, who many of you would know, was vilified for arguing that the Japanese considered an invasion, but the opportunity to invade never came. More than that, Stanley found no evidence of an invasion plan. Similarly, Craig Stockings exposed the Battle of Bardia myths in the latest edition of the Australian War Memorials Wartime magazine, and I quote, "We do not require myths in order to comprehend their successes and failures. Let the tools of historical inquiry speak. They may not always whisper Anzac, but they will talk true," Stockings wrote. I wholeheartedly agree with Stanley and Stockings. What's wrong with telling the truth? Now for a slight twist to my argument. Today, March 1, 68 years ago, Japan landed 25,000 of its best troops on Java. They were opposed by an indifferent Dutch imperial force so impotent it made Captain Mannering's army look like a bunch of Spartans. But there was also a force of 3,000 Australians, led by Adelaide's Brigadier Arthur Blackburn. They had been hastily landed as a sop to Dutch morale and to save the British Empire's face. Blackburn's men provided the only real resistance on the island, inflicting about 1,000 casualties on the invaders before being forced to surrender. Thus began 3.5 years of unimaginable horror for these men. Many slaved on the Burma Tile Railway. Their commander was Weary Dunlop. There they quickly learned that cholera can kill in a day. If they escaped cholera, there was beriberi, there was dengue fever, there was dysentery. Torture, starvation, humiliation, execution. 1 in 3 of these soldiers died in captivity. Here, the hype and the truth converge. Once a year, some of the survivors, now all in their high 80s and 90s, their wives, widows and families, gather just up there behind you on the pathway of honour to remember and to shed a tear. Meeting them was the biggest blessing of writing this book. We've stayed in touch since, and I'm blessed to be able to call some of them friends. These men thought they were fighting to avert an invasion of Australia. This helped sustain them during their imprisonment. Were they wrong to think this just because it may have been disproved 60 years later? Of course not. The historical record evolves as new material becomes available, which is right and proper. But nothing changes the belief they had at the time, which was that they were defending their homeland. Of course, this is also right and proper. For if anyone does own the past, at least a piece of it, it's these wonderful, beautiful men. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and we're ahead of our schedule. I now come to our third and final speaker, Elias, and his remarkable work, The Collector of Worlds. He is a rather remarkable person, I've been gathering, coming originally from Bulgaria, moving to Germany, India? No, not India, I don't. India, East Africa, South Africa. He now lives in Vienna and got here yesterday. And he's going on, I think, to somewhere else after today. So he's a man on the move, and this book, The Collector of Worlds, is, he tells us in the blurb, inspired by the life and works of Sir Richard Burton. He also tells us that all individual lives are mysterious, and we shall now hear what he really means by that. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm amazed by the crowd. Must be the biggest crowd at a literary event on a Monday morning in world history. Fabulous. And looking at you, I'm sure you weren't. It's not a school class that's been organized, though. Anyway, who owns the past? I have to say something different now. So I'm going to say I'm actually hugely intrigued by that question. The reason is that the answer is very simple and very brutal. Those in power own the past. And the reason is that the sources that historians use are tainted. They always are tainted. Sources are falsified, as they're written down. Anyone who's studied the way an authoritarian regime works knows that. So what you do is sources are then falsified a second time through age, through distance. So by the time you analyze them, you have to cut through several layers of falsification, which you can only do through imagination. So basically, at the end of the day, what the Australian lady, whose name I forgot now, sorry, what was the name? Inga Clendon, sorry, Inga Clendon. What she says is, I think, a little bit bizarre, because I don't see a substantial difference between historians and novelists. To actually reach some kind of level of metaphysical truth, they have to use their own imagination. Which is usually what happens when you're looking at the history of places which have undergone very brutal kind of renderings of history. I'll give you one example. The country where I was born, Bulgaria. Everything that we can study regarding the communist past of Bulgaria from 1944 to 1989 has been written, compiled by the state, by the Secret Service, by the party, by the police. On the second level, access to all those archives is limited or not allowed. So what you have is you have an archive that in itself is not reliable, and you have an unreliable access to this archive. At the same time, those people who witnessed the brutality of that system are dying, and there are very, very few people who ever bothered to actually speak to these people, and there are very, very few books written by those people. So what you have is, if we wait for another 10 or 20 years, the only face, the only description of history that will remain in place is the version compiled and written by the state. And therefore you will actually obliterate history as a complex, plural, diversified narrative. Which is why I believe that novelists actually have a very, very important, a decisive role to play, because novelists, of course based on research, but every good novelist does do as much research as a good historian, I would say. Of course, based on research, they actually have the means to give a voice to those who have been silenced. And to me, that is probably the most important function, role, and challenge to any novelist. So that is why, in the case of Bulgaria, I've been talking to survivors from the Bulgarian gulags and prisons for the last 15 years, trying to compile an alternative, a subaltern version of events, and it's extremely difficult because, on the other hand, every person who's been traumatized, again, has a very limited recollection of what he went through. To come to the novel that I'm presenting here, The Collector of Worlds, again, you have a history, Victorian age, 19th century, where most of the documents, most of the archives tell the story of the British imperial power. And you have very, very little that tells the other part of the story, very little that tells you what the Indian servants, the African guides thought about this age. And interestingly enough, even amongst African historians, for example, you have very little interest in Africans who were engaged in this process. So that is why I took one person who was actually the most important guide, African guide, in that period. His name was Sidi Mubarak Bombay, who was a slave. In those days, when a slave was sold, he lost his name, and he took up the name of the place he was sold to. So he was sold in Zanzibar to an Indian trader who took him to Bombay, so his new name was Bombay. And when the man died, the Indian trader died, he set him free in his will, so he returned to Zanzibar, and he became the first professional and the most important professional guide of the 19th century. Amazing thing is that white people always claim that they discovered places. which is a little bit ridiculous because they didn't know where they were going, number one. And number two is there was always an African with them who told them, actually, if you cross that river and then... So Sidi Mubarak Bombay was that man, and he was actually the guide to the very first expedition into Central Africa. It's called the Burton Speke expedition, the second one, Speke Grand, the famous expedition by Stanley, and the first crossing of the continent by Cameron. So this is the man who actually is the greatest traveler of the 19th century, and he's completely unknown because he was a former slave and he's an African, so tough luck for him.